Hey everyone, I want to prepare you for your quiz this week. It's a little tricky, multiple choice, so I want to make sure you're as ready as can be. So, gotta again remember the deductive versus inductive, and remember only inductive is how you derive theories, okay? Deductive can only test theories. And then you need to make sure that you remember about how social science is there to use scientific methods and collect data through various methods that you're going to learn, and that when we're studying the social world, studying how people interact, that's social science. We use very similar processes to study the physical world, the biological world, and we actually use the exact same statistical methods in social sciences as are used in the other sciences as well. You'll need to remember a little bit about the ethical issues as well. And there was the whole issues of the Milgram tea experiment, where people were kind of outed for their homosexual activities in public restrooms. And because he tracked the identity of people through their license plates, we consider that unethical by today's standards. People didn't consent to be part of that study, and by not consenting to be part of the study but being in it nonetheless, that is considered unethical. Now actually there are ways that we can use deception today in ethical ways, but it has to be justified to an institutional review board first, that the benefits of such a study outweigh any potential negatives to people that participate in that. But usually we don't use deception unless absolutely necessary, where that both the study is important, and by revealing the details of the study, it would negatively impact people's participation. And one of those unethical studies is also the Tuskegee Airmen, and these were men that were known to have syphilis. A treatment was available at that time, but it was not offered to these men. And so from the 1940s all the way into the 1970s, they were just observed to see what would happen. Now, it's unethical because A, these were all African American men, and B, they were government employees, and we shouldn't experiment on government employees, and C, a treatment was available, but it was purposely not given to them to see what would happen, and it of course had negative impacts on their health and their lives, and led to the further spread of syphilis in the community. And so it didn't end until it became kind of public knowledge that these people in the study were not being offered the treatment even though the treatment was available. So treatment was known even early on in the study, and so it was unethical that it was purposely withheld from them just to see what would happen. We can't do those kinds of experiments on even prisoners today because they're considered vulnerable populations, and we don't experiment on people without consent, and Tuskegee was an example of an experiment without consent. And then when we're reviewing studies for their ethics, we use something called the Institutional Review Board, and the Belmont Report in 1979, building on ethical standards from the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s, but that itself, built on ethical issues from even decades before, found that it's important that any study should be reviewed by people that have no stake in the results to ensure that it's safe and ethical. The test question is a little bit tricky there, but remember, it's Institutional Review Board, and you can write that down. Institutional Review Board, that's the group that reviews the ethics of studies. Furthermore, when we're thinking about the guidelines to protect people, remember the three primary guidelines that matter are avoiding harm, maintaining confidentiality, and obtaining consent. So those are kind of critical when we're thinking about a study. We want to make sure people are aware of it, that the participation doesn't lead to any negative effects on them, and that they aren't harmed. And then we had one slide where we talked about different perspectives. And there's the positivist perspective. Positivist perspective is the idea that there is a truth and we can discover it. And most scientists fall under that perspective that there's a known truth, that there's a discoverable truth out there. That's positivism. And that through objective, unbiased efforts we can discover what's true. Another perspective that's very different is the social constructionist perspective. And the social constructionist perspective is this idea that everything is a little bit subjective. There isn't as much a right or wrong as much as there is context and culture. So when we think about like what's the right way to raise a child, there's certain things that we today think of as wrong if it's abusive or something, but in terms of how strict you are, in terms of the specifics of how much you push academics versus sports versus discovering yourself, there's different cultural angles that one could take, and depending on the cultural context, people might have a different view on what's the best way to parent. And a lot of moral issues, there's a bit of a social constructionist perspective there, where context may in fact have some influence in how you feel about what's right or wrong in a given situation. Or outside of morals, just when we're trying to understand what motivates people, motivation can be different in different individuals and in different cultures and in different time periods. And so, say we want to know what leads to depression, a positivist would have, there's very clear criteria that lead to depression, being alone and having negative words said at you, that leads to depression, versus a social constructionist would take a more nuanced approach, saying that there's lots of individual differences in the risk factors and coping mechanisms that would make sense. So I would say that the medical field tries to take as positivist approach as possible, like with medicines, this works or this doesn't work, and counselors tend to take a more social constructionist perspective, that there isn't necessarily one perfect response to a client's issues. It depends on the details of that client and the context, right? There's also the critical perspective, in which we focus on power and oppression and social justice as a root cause of a lot of the social issues. And if we look at what's happening inside of prisons and such, you could see the power dynamics within people that are imprisoned, as well as between the staff and the people that are incarcerated. So the critical perspective also can be applied to political situations, political power, and so there are many situations where power, social justice are a driving force, and that critical perspective is a way of seeing the world through that power dynamic. And then there's postmodernist. Postmodernist has this idea that there is no truth. There's just, everyone has their own perspective. What's true for me may not be true for you. And it's the opposite of positivism, in that we can try and discover truth, but there may be no single truth out there. It's complicated is the answer. Okay, so be aware of those different perspectives. And then when we're thinking about theory, theories are explanations. They tell us about how things work. It helps us make sense of interrelated phenomena like education and income and life satisfaction. We can use theory to see how education can influence your income, which can influence your life satisfaction later in life and have impacts on later generations. We can know that theory also can be useful to predict behavior or attitudes, because that explanation can help us predict what might happen. We know that theory can also have implications to other studies, because if the theory is proven to be valuable, then we can apply that in the real world. And a theory also helps us identify what we're measuring and what we're studying. So the theory question on the quiz is a little bit confusing, and it has a reference to hypothesis testing, and know that theories are in fact useful for hypothesis testing. In fact, that's how deductive works. You have a theory, and then you test the hypothesis. All right, so know that there is, in fact, a relationship between theory and hypothesis testing. Next, there's a question about protection of human subjects research and confidentiality. And know that we can't make people fully anonymous in studies oftentimes, because when we collect the data, we see them. Sometimes we need them to sign informed consent. So we can't guarantee anonymity often, but we can guarantee confidentiality. And even with an email survey, your IP address is often recorded by the software. So sometimes we have some way of identifying on some level who someone might have been, but we can try and keep it confidential. So that's the best we can do when we're trying to protect human subjects, is offer confidentiality, and that will protect, not reveal people's identity. There are ways where sometimes one can be completely anonymous, but that is usually only in the case of large-scale research or secondary data analysis. In any other data collection, usually confidentiality is all we can promise. And then when we're doing informed consent, the informed consent document needs to talk about the purpose of the study and the risks of the study and the benefits to society and how people's confidentiality will be safeguarded. But the informed consent document is supposed to be short. It's just a very brief description so people have an idea of what they're involved in before they do it. And know that while you have to do a review of the literature before you do the study to back up and prove that you know what you're doing, and that the study is designed well, but you don't need to share that in the informed consent process. The informed consent process is just a brief description of the study and its risks, all people need to know. And then finally on the quiz, there's a case study question. It gives you a situation, and it's asking you about what type of research it is. And there was a slide where I talked about the difference between descriptive, explanatory, and descriptive and explanatory studies. And a descriptive study just tells us about that immediate situation, versus an explanatory study gives us kind of a deeper cause and effect study explanation. If we're just making observations about something that's happening, that is inductive. So if we're just learning based on what we see, coming with an explanation, that's inductive, versus we already have an explanation, we want to test it, that's deductive. Okay, so I think you guys are going to be okay on that last question. If you read the story and think, what are we really trying to do? Are we just trying to describe it? Are we trying to use our observations to develop an explanation? Or can we in fact link cause and effect, which I'll see what your logic takes you to. If you have any problem with the quiz, please let me know, and I'm happy to review with you, and I can go in and change scores if necessary. All right? Look forward to talking to you soon.